Participating, most people interpret silence as rejection. They assume that if someone stops talking, stops checking in, or disappears from their daily life, it means they've been forgotten. But psychologically, silence usually means the opposite. Participating silence is not emotional deletion, it's emotional processing. When a connection ends or fades, the mind doesn't instantly let go, it goes into a state of internal sorting. Emotions that were once regulated through interaction now have nowhere to go. Participating, so they turn inward. Thoughts get replayed, moments get re-examined, conversations get remembered in detail. Silence becomes a space where unresolved feelings live. People don't go quiet because they feel nothing. Participating, they go quiet because feeling too much becomes overwhelming. Distance creates safety. It allows the nervous system to breathe to regain control, to avoid vulnerability. But that doesn't mean the emotional bond disappears, it simply becomes private. Participating, this is why someone can appear completely fine on the outside while emotionally revisiting the past on the inside. Social media smiles, new routines, even new relationships don't erase emotional memory. They distract from it. Participating, the heart processes long after the mind pretends to move on. Silence is often the mind's way of avoiding emotional exposure. Reaching out would reopen feelings that haven't resolved yet. So instead of forgetting, people retreat. Participating, they choose quiet over confrontation with their own emotions. And the stronger the emotional connection was, the longer that internal process takes. Emotional imprints don't dissolve quickly. They resurface in patterns, certain songs, places, habits. Participating, or even emotional states, trigger memories unexpectedly. That's why people think about someone months later without understanding why. The absence doesn't remove emotional attachment, it intensifies it. When you're no longer there to provide emotional grounding, participating, the nervous system is forced to carry the weight alone, and that weight often leads to reflection. People remember how they felt around you more than what you said or did. Emotional states leave deeper imprints than facts. Feeling understood, safe, desired. Participating or emotionally connected becomes part of their emotional identity. So when communication stops, the emotional system doesn't shut down, it turns inward. The mind keeps processing. The heart keeps recalibrating. Silence becomes a place where emotional memory is replayed. And this is why reaching out too soon often backfires. It interrupts the natural emotional process. It replaces reflection with reassurance. Participating, it comforts the nervous system instead of allowing it to feel the absence. True emotional processing requires space. Without space, nothing is felt deeply. And without feeling deeply, nothing is remembered clearly. So if you think silence means you were forgotten, participating, understand this silence usually means the emotional connection is being processed, not erased. When someone becomes emotionally comfortable with you, your presence stops feeling temporary. It starts feeling permanent, and permanence changes perception. Participating, the mind no longer registers your presence as something to appreciate, it registers it as something to expect. That's when emotional awareness fades, not because feelings disappear, but because they no longer feel urgent. Participating, this is why absence after comfort hits so differently. When someone feels safe, assuming you'll always be there, your disappearance creates emotional shock. The nervous system feels a sudden disruption in what it believed was stable. Participating, and that disruption forces attention. Before, your presence blended into the emotional background. You were part of their daily emotional environment. They didn't need to think about you. You were simply there. But when you're gone, the contrast becomes unavoidable. Participating, the emotional system finally notices what it lost. This is the psychological power of contrast. We don't miss what we actively choose. We miss what we unconsciously depended on. When something disappears that was emotionally familiar, participating, the brain triggers a sense of loss, even if the person believed they had already moved on. Comfort creates emotional blindness. It makes people forget how much something matters until it's no longer available. Participating, that's why people often realize the value of a connection only after distance is created. Not during conflict, not during boredom, but during silence. The absence forces emotional recalibration. Suddenly, small things become noticeable again. The lack of messages. Participating, the lack of shared routines, the lack of emotional support. The nervous system begins comparing what is with what was, and that comparison activates memory. Emotional memory becomes sharper in absence. Moments that felt ordinary before now feel meaningful. Or emotional states that were taken for granted now feel irreplaceable. This is also why moving on too quickly rarely feels complete. People may distract themselves with new connections, new habits, or new environments, participating, but emotional familiarity doesn't transfer instantly. The nervous system still remembers the emotional rhythm of what it had before. So even when someone appears to have forgotten you, emotionally they're still adjusting to a new baseline. Participating, they're learning how to exist without the emotional environment you once created. And here's the key: the more emotionally comfortable they were with you, the more deeply they feel the absence. Not consciously at first, but subtly. It shows up in moments of quiet, participating in moments of stress, in moments when they need emotional grounding and realize it's no longer available. They don't miss you because you're gone. Participating, they miss you because your absence disrupts a part of their emotional identity they didn't realize was built around you. And that's why disappearance after comfort creates more emotional impact than presence ever did. Participating emotional connections don't vanish the way conversations do. You can stop talking to someone, stop seeing them, even stop thinking about them consciously, but the emotional imprint remains stored in the nervous system. It becomes a pattern, not a memory. Participating in patterns don't disappear, they resurface. Every strong emotional bond creates internal associations. Certain feelings get linked to a person's voice, presence, or energy. Feeling calm, feeling desired, feeling understood over time. Participating, those emotional states become wired together with that person's identity. So when the connection ends, the brain doesn't simply delete those pathways, it keeps them. And whenever a similar emotional state is triggered, loneliness, stress, nostalgia, vulnerability, participating, the old emotional pattern activates. The person comes to mind not because you forced it, but because the nervous system remembered how it once felt safe. This is why people often think about someone long after they believe they've moved on. Participating not because they're secretly obsessed, but because emotional memory is state-based. It doesn't respond to logic, it responds to feeling. A song plays, a place reminds them of you. A moment of silence opens emotional space. Suddenly, participating in your presence reappears in their mind, not as a choice, but as an emotional reflex. This is also why emotional connections can resurface years later. Time weakens surface memory, but emotional memory stays intact. Participating, the emotional brain remembers how it felt even when the conscious mind forgets details. That's why people are often surprised by who they miss. Not necessarily the person they dated most recently, but the one who made them feel something unique. Participating emotional intensity creates deeper imprints than duration ever could. And here's the part most people misunderstand. Emotional resurfacing doesn't always mean wanting to reconnect. It means unresolved emotional associations still exist. Participating, the mind is simply revisiting a pattern it never fully closed. This is why closure rarely comes from conversation. It comes from emotional replacement. When new emotional experiences become stronger than old ones, the nervous system gradually updates its patterns. Participating. But until that happens, emotional imprints continue to surface. They appear in moments of vulnerability, reflection, or emotional openness. They show up when the mind isn't distracted. So when someone thinks about you after a long time, participating, it's not because they failed to move on. It's because emotional memory operates independently of conscious intention, and that's what makes emotional connections powerful. They don't require attention to survive, they require meaning. Meaning leaves traces. Participating, and those traces always find their way back to awareness. Most people believe that disappearing is what creates impact, that if you vanish long enough, someone will eventually miss you. But absence alone is not what changes how someone feels. Participating, it's who you become during that absence. Without real internal change, distance is just empty space. If you disappear but stay the same emotionally, nothing truly shifts. The dynamic remains intact, the emotional roles stay frozen. You may not be present physically, participating, but energetically, you're still attached, still waiting, still hoping. And that energy is always felt even without contact. Real impact happens when your life changes, when your mindset upgrades, when your routines evolve. Participating, when your emotional baseline becomes stronger than it was before. That transformation creates emotional contrast, because now if they ever see you again, even indirectly, the comparison becomes unavoidable. You're no longer the same emotional reference point. Participating, you've become someone different. This is why growth is far more powerful than disappearance. Growth creates new identity, and identity is what people respond to, not distance. When someone senses that you're moving forward, not stuck in emotional loops, participating, something in their perception shifts. They're no longer comparing the present to the past. They're comparing themselves to you, and that creates internal discomfort, not jealousy, not regret, but awareness. Awareness that you're evolving without them. Participating, awareness that you didn't collapse emotionally. Awareness that your life didn't pause. This is when emotional curiosity returns. Not because they suddenly miss you, but because the emotional narrative they had about you no longer matches reality. Participating, you've broken the emotional pattern. Before, they knew who you were in the relationship. They knew how you showed up. They knew your emotional role. But now that role doesn't exist anymore, and that's unsettling. Because people don't miss individuals. Participating, they miss emotional identities. They miss how someone fit into their emotional world. When you change, you no longer fit the old identity, and that forces emotional reevaluation. They start wondering, who is this person now? How did they grow? Participating, what changed inside them? That curiosity doesn't come from silence, it comes from transformation. And here's the truth most people avoid. If your growth is real, the outcome no longer matters. Whether they return or not becomes secondary. Participating, because you're no longer trying to reclaim a connection, you've built a new foundation. You're no longer disappearing to be noticed. You're evolving to become aligned with who you actually are. And that alignment creates impact, whether anyone is watching or not. Participating, before someone ever reaches out, before they send a message, before they like a photo or ask about you, something quieter happens. First, curiosity. It starts internally, without action, without words, without signals you can see. Participating, and that's why most people assume they've been forgotten, because emotional interest returns privately long before it becomes visible. When someone feels the emotional absence and begins processing it, the first response is not contact, it's thought. Participating, they start wondering what you're doing, how you're living, whether you've changed, whether you're happier, stronger, different. The mind seeks information before it seeks connection. This is where most people get it wrong. They think if someone hasn't reached out, participating, it means they don't care, but psychologically, curiosity comes before courage, before vulnerability, before risking rejection or reopening emotions. People don't immediately act on emotional awareness. They observe first. They reflect first. Participating, they test their feelings internally before they test reality. They might check your social presence, ask mutual friends, think about you during quiet moments, compare their current emotional state to how they felt with you. None of this is visible. Participate, but all of it is real. Curiosity is the bridge between emotional memory and emotional action. It's the phase where someone is emotionally engaged but not yet ready to expose themselves. Because reaching out means risking something. Participate, it means admitting the absence mattered. It means reopening emotional space. It means facing feelings they may not fully understand yet. So instead, they stay silent and curious. They monitor from a distance. They imagine scenarios. They replay conversations. Participating, they wonder how you would respond now after time has passed. And this internal process can last much longer than people expect. Weeks, months, sometimes longer. Because emotional curiosity doesn't follow logic, it follows emotional readiness. Participating, and here's the important part, the stronger your internal growth, the deeper that curiosity becomes. Not because you're trying to be mysterious, but because you're no longer emotionally predictable. They can't assume who you are anymore. Participating, they don't know how you feel. They don't know if you're still available in the same way. And uncertainty fuels curiosity more than reassurance ever could. This is why reaching out too early often ruins the process. Participating, it answers questions before the emotional system has fully felt them. It replaces curiosity with comfort. Curiosity needs space to develop. It needs silence to grow. It needs emotional contrast to sharpen. Participating, when someone finally does reach out after curiosity, it's different. It's not casual. It's not random. It's the result of internal emotional movement. But by that point, something else has already changed. You're no longer waiting, participating. You're no longer watching for signs. You're no longer emotionally tracking their behavior. You've moved in your life. So whether curiosity turns into contact or not, the real shift has already happened. You're no longer trying to be remembered. Participating, you're becoming someone who no longer needs to be. At some point, the question stops being about them. You stop wondering what they feel, what they remember, or whether you still matter to them. The emotional spotlight slowly turns inward, and for the first time, participating, you become the main character in your own life. Again, this is the moment most people never expect. They spend so long focused on being remembered that they forget to build something worth remembering. They chase closure, validation, and emotional reassurance, participating, thinking that will heal the wound. But real healing doesn't come from being chosen. It comes from choosing yourself. When your life starts moving forward, your priorities shift. You invest in your body, your mindset, your goals, your environment. Participating, you create structure where there was emotional chaos. You build habits where there was emotional waiting. And with each small change, your identity begins to strengthen. You're no longer defined by a past connection. You're no longer living inside emotional memory. Participating, you're building present momentum, and momentum is powerful because it replaces emotional stagnation. It gives your mind something real to focus on, something tangible to grow into, something that isn't dependent on someone else's decisions. Participating. This is when the real surprise happens. Not that they remember you, but that you no longer care whether they do. You realize that your value was never tied to their attention. Your worth was never dependent on being chosen. Participating, your identity was never meant to live inside someone else's emotional world. You become someone who attracts naturally because you're no longer seeking. You're grounded, you're stable, you're self-directed. And from that place, if someone reaches out, participating, it doesn't feel like salvation. It feels like an option. You're not trying to rebuild the past. You're evaluating the present. You're no longer asking, do they still think about me? You're asking, does this align with who I've become? Participating in that shift changes everything. Because now, whether someone remembers you or not no longer controls your emotional state. You've moved from being emotionally reactive to emotionally sovereign. You're not waiting to be chosen. Participating, you're choosing the life you want to live. And once you reach that point, the question of whether they forgot you becomes irrelevant. You didn't disappear from their memory. You disappeared from your own need to be remembered.